Communist dictatorship in Hungary under Mátyás Rákosi, 1946 to 1956. In June 1947, 2 years after the Second World War ended, the U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall announced a substantial aid program of $14 billion, approximately $200 billion today, for European countries devastated in the aftermath of the war. This package greatly assisted Western European economies recovering from the acute hardship caused by the war. In 1947, Hungary also faced high levels of poverty, and the Marshall Plan would have provided a tremendous boost to the economy. However, in tandem with the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria, the Hungarian government rejected the offer of aid, claiming its acceptance would compromise Hungary's independence. So, why did Hungary really reject the Marshall Plan? Why did the country become an ally of the Soviet Union? And what was life actually like for Hungarians under the communist dictatorship? The devastated nation. Following the front's withdrawal from Hungary in early April 1945, catastrophic conditions ensued. The occupying Soviet forces deported over 600,000 Hungarians to the Soviet Union, including prisoners of war and civilians alike, a third of them never returning. Atrocities against women were barbaric. Soviet troops brutally raped and assaulted tens of thousands of Hungarian women and girls. As Hungary's borders again shifted after the war, Hungarians who found themselves on the wrong side of those borders were ostracized by the neighboring countries and made to pay for Hungary's so-called collective guilt. In Czechoslovakia, for instance, Hungarians were stripped of their legal rights and their property confiscated. In Romania, massacres were undertaken by organized terror squads. In Yugoslavia, around 10,000 Hungarians were slaughtered by partisan Serbs. The devastation in the remaining parts of the country was no less appalling. The number of civilian and military casualties, including victims of the Holocaust, POWs, and civilians deported to the Soviet Union, exceeded 1 million. Proportional to its size, this made Hungary the fourth country most devastated by the loss of human life from the war, following the Soviet Union, Poland, and Germany. Material losses were equally substantial, with the war obliterating 40% of the nation's wealth. All bridges spanning the Danube and Tisa rivers were destroyed, and towns throughout the country lay in ruins from the Allied forces' carpet bombings and the Soviets' artillery sieges. A significant portion of the country's livestock perished due to requisition, and the retreating Germans plundered machinery from factories and plants. Whatever they left behind was instantly seized by the Soviet army. Democracy or dictatorship? "Last night I had a dream," said politician Imre Kovács of the National Peasant Party. "After the Germans left, no one came in their place." The sarcastic words darkly articulated the post-war fate of Hungary and the other Central European nations that went on to fall under Soviet occupation, and whose destiny was decided by Franklin Roosevelt, Joseph Stalin, and Winston Churchill. At the start of the war, the leaders of the Allied powers had declared in the Atlantic Charter that they desired to see no territorial changes that do not accord with the freely expressed wishes of the people concerned, and that they respect the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they will live. However, these principles appeared forsaken when it came to deciding the fate of Central and Eastern European nations. The evidence of the negotiations between the three great powers is seen on the slip of paper on which Churchill sketched the different political spheres of interest. According to this document, Hungary would be divided between the Western and Soviet powers, 50-50. Ultimately, nothing came out of this. Stalin's will prevailed, and after the war, Hungary fell completely under Soviet control. National parliamentary elections in 1945 showed Hungarians' unequivocal desire for democracy. The Independent Smallholders Party won a resounding 57% of the vote. The Communists secured just 17%. Sadly, this was essentially an irrelevance. Actual power was wielded by the occupying Soviet military forces and its leaders, Marshal Sviridov and Marshal Voroshilov. Thus, the smallholders, disallowed from forming an independent government, had to fill key political and military positions with Communist Party members, later making it possible for them to seize power. The Peace Treaty. Hungary signed its peace treaty with the Allied powers concluding the Second World War in February 1947. Initially, the British and Americans supported giving Hungary back some territory it had lost to Romania after World War I as part of the Treaty of Trianon, specifically a smaller part of the territories inhabited by ethnic Hungarians. This support proved short-lived, however, as Stalin's opposition won out. With the principles of the Atlantic Charter nowhere in sight, the ethnically unjust placement of borders was reinforced to those of 1920. To add further insult to the injury, 3 additional villages were annexed to Czechoslovakia. In contrast to the Treaty of Trianon, the Paris Treaty didn't include protection measures for ethnic minorities. However, it did impose a heavy burden of compensation. In the years that followed, Hungary had to allocate 25 to 30% of its budget to the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, and Czechoslovakia for war reparations. Its budget also had to provide for the occupying Soviet army. However, the most serious consequence of the peace treaty was the provision allowing Soviet troops indefinite leave to remain stationed on Hungarian territory. This sealed the fate of the country. In the decades to come, the presence of the Soviet army ensured Hungary's subjugation to the Soviet Empire and the establishment and maintenance of communist dictatorship until its final collapse in 1990. Hungary became both a member and captive of the Soviet bloc, and thus couldn't accept the Marshall Aid. Communist takeover. In 1945, alongside the Red Army, Hungarian communist leaders returned home from many years of exile in Moscow. Their leader was Mátyás Rákosi, who'd held a high-ranking position in Hungary's short-lived communist regime in 1919 and had spent over a decade in prison during Horthy's rule. Rákosi and his comrades carried out Stalin's mission: the radical transformation of society, elimination of democracy and free market economy, and establishment of a Soviet-style communist dictatorship that would serve the Soviet Union. They employed any means to achieve this, knowing that they had the backing of the occupying power. Anyone questioning Soviet rule and communist ideology was labeled fascist, reactionary, and an enemy of democracy, which, in other words, meant communism. Such individuals were stripped of their positions, imprisoned, or even executed. The governing Smallholders Party leaders became targets of press campaigns, street protests, arrests, political trials, and severe prison sentences. Eventually, the smallholder Prime Minister Ferenc Nagy fled abroad, while the party's General Secretary, Béla Kovács, was abducted by Soviet authorities when Hungarian state authorities couldn't secure his compliance. Before the 1947 parliamentary elections, the voting rights of 500,000 citizens were revoked, and on the day of the vote, the largest electoral fraud in Hungarian history was carried out. Despite these actions, the Communists won only 22% of the vote. Rákosi and his comrades, realizing the Hungarian people wouldn't elect them, never held democratic elections again. Instead, they dismantled the other parties, imprisoned or forced their leaders into exile, and established the dictatorship of the Communist Party, known as the Hungarian Workers' Party, or simply the Party, since it was the only party in power. Setting up the dictatorship. The process of eliminating the remnants of old Hungary began immediately after the war, during the term of the coalition government. Large and medium-sized estates were redistributed among landless peasants. The institution of the monarchy was abolished, and a republic was declared. Education was nationalized, and religious and private schools were shut down. Following the Allied Potsdam Agreement, which validated the principle of collective guilt, Hungarian authorities deported 200,000 Hungarian citizens of German ethnicity to Germany. Reconstruction of the country began rapidly, but was initially halted by unprecedented hyperinflation. Whilst in the summer of 1945 a kilogram of bread cost 6 pengus, less than a year later it cost 8 million pengus, and a month after that 6 billion. On August 1, 1946, a new currency was introduced. 1 forint, the price of 1 kilogram of bread, was equivalent to 4 times 10 to the 29 pengus. In 1947–48, the communist government abolished civil rights. Following the dissolution of political parties, with the stroke of a pen, Interior Minister László Rajk banned all associations and civil organizations. They nationalized factories, banks, industrial plants, shops, and larger or more valuable residential buildings and apartments. With the exception of small peasant holdings, private property ownership and the free market economy were eliminated. The press and publishing houses were also monopolized, coming under state ownership. From then on, only those newspapers, books, and films that supported the Communist Party line could be published. Churches were persecuted, religious orders were disbanded, and numerous clergymen were arrested. By the end of 1948, the only remaining openly anti-communist institution was the Hungarian Catholic Church, led by the Archbishop of Esztergom, Cardinal József Mindszenty. His arrest, on the second day of Christmas, signaled to society that the authorities could do whatever they pleased. Mindszenty was ultimately sentenced to life imprisonment on fabricated charges. Freedom of speech was suppressed. In László Rajk's words, "People who advocate a program different from the building of socialism are not considered constructive opposition to the government, but rather as enemies of the Hungarian people." And what awaited the enemies of the people? Imprisonment, internment, deportation, and often death. The Land of Iron and Steel. Internationally acclaimed Hungarian author Sándor Márai described the system in 1948, the year of his emigration, as a transition between a concentration camp and a madhouse. Economic policy in Hungary was characterized by a series of fiscally illogical measures. To secure the financial resources needed for forced industrialization, the communist government sought to exploit the agricultural sector based on the Soviet model. To achieve this, peasant farms were burdened with unbearable taxes and mandatory crop quotas. Those failing to meet their delivery obligations or concealing any portion of their produce could end up in prison. Between 1948 and 1953, nearly 500,000 peasants were sentenced because they couldn't fulfill their increasing delivery quotas. By persecuting peasant-run farms and targeting wealthy farmers branded kulaks, the government aimed to eliminate private ownership within the agricultural sector and instead establish cooperatives. Through these, the state could freely redirect income to finance industrialization. The result saw many peasants fleeing from rural areas to cities, and many others committing suicide, finding themselves in hopeless, desperate circumstances. Despite the considerable efforts of the state, it failed to completely collectivize the agricultural sector. A significant portion of determined farmers held on to their land. The complete nationalization of other economic sectors was carried out within 1 to 2 years, replacing the free market with a government-controlled planned economy without any compensation to former owners. Following the example of the Soviet Union, Rákosi aimed to transform Hungary into the land of iron and steel. Huge industrial investments were undertaken, the most famous being Stalinváros, today's Dunaújváros, and its steel mill. However, Hungary had very little iron ore, and its coal mines produced low-quality coal in insufficient quantities. Thus, this branch of economic development didn't align with the country's natural resources. Similarly, money was spent cultivating plants incompatible with Hungary's climate. Unsurprisingly, Hungarian cotton production proved to be a failure. Another fiasco was the appointment of unqualified workers to lead state institutions, factories, and plants, replacing industry experts and former owners. Many of those appointed to leadership positions had barely completed the 8th grade. During the nationalization of MAOR, a company primarily owned by Americans extracting oil in Zala County, the company's chief geologist, Szymon Pap, was falsely charged with sabotage and sentenced to death. This was later commuted to life imprisonment, likely due to Pap's expertise, which they couldn't do without. For years, he had to assist in the development of the Hungarian oil industry from behind bars. The incompetence of the newly appointed leaders was perhaps best evidenced when spelling courses had to be mandated for employees of the Ministry of Education. Untenable investments, leadership ineptitude, and an overriding demand for plan fulfillment caused total economic chaos. Real income decreased, and essential goods and services faced shortages. In fact, the government had to reintroduce food rationing to ensure basic food supply, a practice used previously only during wartime. Who is not with us is against us. It wasn't just freedom of speech that was curtailed, but the freedom to remain silent too. Rákosi's motto was, "Who is not with us is against us." Therefore, people were forced to openly prove their support for the system or face being suspected of dissent. In schools, workplaces, and public events, the ceremonial glorification of the Soviet Union, the party, and party leaders was demanded. This wasn't an easy task, since the slogans were in stark contrast to people's everyday experiences. The party introduced the Soviet model of the cult of personality, something entirely foreign to Hungarian tradition. Budapest's most beautiful boulevard was named after Stalin. Trolleybuses began their numbering with 70 in honor of his 70th birthday, and on major state occasions, hundreds of thousands of people had to march before a giant statue of the dictator. Known as Stalin's best Hungarian disciple, party leader Mátyás Rákosi also became the object of this cult of personality. Images and statues of Rákosi, referred to as the wise teacher and father, abounded in public institutions, and enormous portraits of him were displayed at parades. In 1952, his 60th birthday was celebrated with a grand performance at the Opera House. It became a necessary ritual to rise and interrupt Rákosi's speeches with rhythmic applause, accompanied by the resounding "Long live Rákosi, long live the party." This could go on for minutes, with no one wanting to be the first to stop clapping. Demonstrating a belief in the goals of the party was required, often through investing significant portions of already meager salaries in government bonds, so-called peace loans, or purchasing the written works of Lenin, Stalin, and Rákosi. Participating in trade union or party-organized parades, meetings, and leisure activities was also expected. The state regularly intruded into people's private lives, ostracizing those whose behavior or entertainment preferences didn't conform to party expectations. Communist terror. To the masses, the communist dictatorship spelled hardship, economic shortages, an unbearable bureaucratic regime, persecution, and impoverishment. It's little wonder that the system was sustained not by the support of the people, but through administrative means. The task of enforcing terror on a daily basis fell to the secret police, the Hungary's State Protection Authority, AVH, led by Gábor Péter, a former tailor who'd become an army general. During its heyday, this horrific organization, with its 100,000 employees, maintained an extensive network of informants and operated numerous internment and labor camps throughout the country. The extent of the AVH's activities is evident from the fact that between 1950 and 1953, it initiated proceedings against approximately 10% of the adult population. The symbol of intimidation became a big black car used by AVH officers, instilling fear when it stopped in front of people's homes during the night. This widespread terror affected the broadest layers of society. The military, political, and economic elites of the haughty regime, as well as the few affluent Jews who'd managed to survive the Holocaust, were deported or banished to forced labor camps in the countryside. All of this was done to make way for the party leaders to move into their villas in the opulent suburbs of Buda. Many of those deported were sentenced to death on false charges, including businessmen, senior military officials, students, priests, and even star football players. Show trials were held and false confessions obtained through horrific torture, during which many of the accused perished. By 1949, the reign of terror crept into the party as well. Following Stalin's example, Rákosi initiated a purge among communist leaders whom he considered rivals. The most famous example was the public trial and execution of László Reich, who, as Minister of the Interior, had played a major role in establishing the dictatorship. His successors didn't fare well either. János Kádár, a close friend of Reich who'd participated in Reich's interrogation, as the new Minister of the Interior, was himself imprisoned 2 years later. His successor, Sándor Zöld, killed his own family and committed suicide to escape arrest. World-class sports achievements. The golden age of sports, which began during the haughty regime, continued into the 1950s. Following its success at the 1936 Berlin Olympics, Hungary once again secured third place at the 1952 Helsinki Olympics, trailing only behind the USA and the Soviet Union. Perhaps even more memorable was the glory of the Hungarian national soccer team, known as the Golden Team. Led by Ferenc Puskás and consisting of the former Olympic soccer champions, the Hungarian national team defeated the English 6-3 in London in the match of the century. In 1954, they reached the World Cup finals as favourites to win, but were defeated by West Germany. The regime even tried to take credit for these extraordinary sporting achievements. A more convincing explanation, however, lies in the fact that during this period, sports remained one of the few fields where young people could achieve success through their talents and diligence without any ideological commitment. The beginning of the end. After Stalin's death in 1953, the new leaders of the Soviet Union summoned the Hungarian party leadership to Moscow They were severely reprimanded for everything they'd undertaken over the previous years, despite those being largely on Soviet instruction. They ordered that another communist and former Moscow exile, Imre Nagy, become prime minister, while Rákosi was relegated to lead only the party. Nagy's premiership brought some relief. The collectivization of agriculture was temporarily halted. Fellow communists imprisoned during Rákosi's purge were released, and real wages began to increase moderately. However, the essence of oppression remained unchanged. However, by 1955, Rákosi had managed to oust Imre Nagy from both the government and the party, and he once again reigned supreme. However, Hungarians now saw the writing on the wall and sensed the moral decay of communist power. So came October 1956, when hundreds of thousands took to the streets of Budapest shouting to the world what they had been afraid to whisper for years: enough. And this tidal wave of public unity was, in a matter of hours, enough to bring the once fearsome dictatorship crumbling to its knees.